You're smiling like you've already won. The words drifted across the executive boardroom just loud enough for everyone to hear, followed by a few restrained chuckles from the far end of the polished walnut table. The skyline of downtown Chicago shimmered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, while a digital clock mounted above the presentation screen displayed exactly 8:55 a.m. 5 minutes remained before one of the largest corporate mergers in American history would officially begin. Attorneys arranged thick binders with practiced precision. Financial advisors whispered over updated valuation reports. Board members refreshed their tablets, waiting for the final documents to appear. Every face in the room carried the same expression: calculation, anticipation, or barely concealed confidence. Every face except one. Elias Brooks, the black CEO of Brooks Meridian Holdings, sat quietly near the center of the table wearing a navy suit without a pocket square, a plain white shirt, and a simple silver watch that looked older than most of the executives surrounding him. He wasn't checking his phone. He wasn't reviewing paperwork. He wasn't rehearsing arguments. He simply watched the second hand move across the clock with the calm expression of someone arriving exactly where he expected to be. Across from him, Charles Whitmore, the silver-haired CEO of Whitmore Industrial Group, leaned back in his leather chair with an easy smile that had become familiar to everyone on Wall Street. He folded his hands and looked directly at Elias. "Still time to reconsider a few terms," he said smoothly. "No one will blame you for making the practical decision." Several executives nodded almost instinctively. To them, this merger had only one logical ending. Whitmore Industrial would emerge stronger, Brooks Meridian would accept a reduced influence, and Elias Brooks would quietly celebrate surviving a negotiation against one of the country's oldest business empires. That was the story they had already written in their minds before anyone signed a single page. A young associate standing near the wall glanced toward Elias with quiet curiosity. She had spent the last 3 weeks preparing schedules, reviewing contracts, and coordinating confidential meetings, yet she couldn't understand why the only person showing no visible anxiety was the man with the most at stake. Every few seconds another attorney entered carrying revised folders. Every few moments another notification illuminated someone's screen. The atmosphere tightened with each passing minute, but Elias remained perfectly still, as though the room's pressure belonged to everyone except him. Charles noticed it too. "Confidence is admirable," he said with a polite laugh. "But markets don't reward optimism. They reward leverage." A few more smiles appeared around the table. Someone quietly agreed. Someone else whispered that Brooks Meridian had run out of options months ago. Elias finally lifted his eyes from the clock and met Charles's gaze without the slightest trace of irritation. His voice was calm enough that several people leaned forward just to hear him. "You're right," he said. "Leverage decides everything." Then he smiled again. It wasn't the smile of a man hoping for a miracle. It wasn't forced optimism or nervous confidence. It was the quiet smile of someone who had already seen the ending while everyone else was still trying to predict it. Above the presentation screen, the digital clock changed to 8:56 a.m. 4 minutes remained. The quiet confidence in Elias Brooks's expression seemed almost out of place as conversations resumed around the table. The merger documents remained unopened, but opinions flowed freely. A senior investment banker adjusted his glasses and leaned toward another executive. "He is trying to hide the pressure," he whispered. "Nobody stays that calm when they are about to lose this much influence." The other man nodded without hesitation. "Brooks Meridian built impressive momentum, but this room belongs to Whitmore. Everyone knows that." Around the boardroom, assumptions spread faster than facts. Some believed Elias had already accepted private concessions to keep his position. Others speculated that his board had pressured him into signing unfavorable terms simply to avoid a prolonged battle with a corporation nearly twice the size. No one bothered asking Elias what he thought because they believed they already knew the answer. Across the table, Charles Whitmore welcomed every quiet assumption. His confidence filled the room without ever becoming loud. He greeted board members by name, exchanged relaxed smiles with attorneys, and thanked advisors for their hard work as though the celebration had already begun. Even the financial analysts seemed to relax under his presence. It looked less like a negotiation and more like a ceremony confirming an outcome everyone had accepted. Elias noticed every glance directed his way. He recognized the subtle expressions. He had seen them years earlier when he walked into investment meetings wearing an inexpensive suit because every dollar had gone back into his company. He remembered lenders who complimented his ambition before declining his proposals. He remembered conference rooms where people looked past him until they discovered he was leading the presentation. Success had changed his balance sheet, but it had not erased the assumptions waiting quietly beneath polished smiles. A junior legal assistant entered carrying revised signature folders and carefully placed one before every executive. When she reached Elias, she hesitated for a fraction of a second before offering a respectful smile. He returned the gesture with a simple nod. It was the smallest exchange in the room, yet somehow it felt more genuine than every confident handshake taking place around the table. Charles folded his reading glasses and looked toward Elias once again. "There is still an opportunity to demonstrate flexibility," he said. "History remembers leaders who know when to compromise." Several board members murmured in agreement. One even smiled as though offering friendly advice instead of subtle pressure. Elias rested both hands on the unopened folder before him. "History remembers many things," he replied evenly. "Sometimes it simply waits for the right moment to tell the whole story." The answer puzzled more people than it impressed. A few executives exchanged uncertain looks before dismissing his words as confidence masking disappointment. Near the back of the room, the digital countdown continued its steady march. 3 minutes and 30 seconds remained. Every tick of the clock echoed a little louder than before. Outside, helicopters drifted across the Chicago skyline while reporters gathered below the building, convinced they were about to witness the birth of a corporate giant. Inside, nearly everyone believed they knew exactly who would emerge with the upper hand. Nearly everyone except the one man who had not touched a single page of the merger agreement. Elias glanced once more toward the clock, then calmly adjusted the sleeve of his jacket as though he were waiting for a meeting that had not actually started yet. The silence that followed Elias Brooks's last sentence lingered just long enough to make a few people uncomfortable before Charles Whitmore broke it with a measured smile. "Very well," he said. "If everyone is ready, there's one final adjustment before we proceed." Several attorneys immediately looked up from their folders. One of Whitmore's senior legal counsels slid a thin packet across the polished table until it stopped directly in front of Elias. "Nothing significant," the attorney explained. "Simply a clarification regarding post-merger governance." A few executives nodded without even reading the pages, trusting the recommendation because it came from the larger company. Elias lowered his eyes to the document without opening it. The attorney continued speaking with practiced confidence. "Under this revision, operational authority during the first 18 months will be consolidated under a single executive office. It will streamline decision-making and reassure investors during the transition." No one needed to ask whose office that would be. Charles folded his hands and smiled politely. "Temporary leadership creates stability," he said. "After all, markets appreciate certainty." Around the room, agreement came almost automatically. One board member quietly remarked that Brooks Meridian should consider itself fortunate to remain part of the executive structure at all. Another whispered that resisting now would only damage shareholder confidence. The atmosphere shifted again, not through raised voices but through quiet consensus. Pressure did not always arrive as confrontation. Sometimes it wore the appearance of professionalism. Across the table, Elias remained perfectly composed. He gently rested one hand on the unopened amendment without lifting the cover page. "You have not reviewed it?" one attorney asked with visible surprise. Elias looked up. "I have already reviewed every version that matters." The attorney frowned, assuming he had misunderstood. Charles leaned forward slightly, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone explaining an obvious truth. "Business rewards adaptability, Elias. Pride can become expensive." A few restrained laughs drifted through the room. Someone near the windows quietly added, "Especially 5 minutes before closing." Elias neither smiled nor frowned. His expression remained steady, almost thoughtful, as though the conversation unfolding around him belonged to another meeting entirely. He slowly turned his wrist and glanced at the silver watch resting beneath his cuff. 2 minutes and 48 seconds remained. The movement caught the attention of a young financial analyst seated several chairs away. She had spent the morning reviewing market projections, yet something about Elias unsettled her expectations. Most executives facing this degree of pressure tapped their fingers, adjusted their ties, checked messages, or argued over details. Elias did none of those things. His breathing never changed. His posture never shifted. His attention stayed fixed on time itself rather than the people attempting to control him. Charles noticed a glance toward the watch and smiled again. "Waiting for something?" he asked. Elias answered with complete sincerity. "Yes." The single word landed softly, but it carried enough certainty to silence the nearest conversations. "And what exactly are you waiting for?" Charles asked. Elias met his eyes without hesitation. "For everyone in this room to have the same information." Confused expressions spread from one side of the boardroom to the other. Attorneys exchanged uncertain looks. Advisors quietly refreshed their tablets again, wondering whether an expected filing had already appeared. Someone checked the financial news feed. Someone else opened the market alerts. Nothing seemed different. Yet the confidence that had filled the room only moments earlier began to thin almost imperceptibly. Above the presentation screen, the digital clock continued its relentless countdown. 2 minutes remained. The room no longer sounded like a place where billion-dollar decisions were made. It sounded like a room trying to convince itself that nothing unexpected was about to happen. Quiet conversations overlapped with the soft tapping of laptop keys. Coffee cups rested untouched beside neatly stacked contracts. Outside the glass walls, reporters continued gathering below the tower, unaware that the most important battle was unfolding in complete silence 37 floors above them. The digital clock changed again. 1 minute and 59 seconds. 1 minute and 58. Every second seemed louder than the last. Charles Whitmore leaned comfortably into his chair, determined to project complete control. "I think we have waited long enough," he said. "Our shareholders expect certainty, not suspense." Several board members responded with approving nods. One attorney reached for his pen. Another carefully aligned the signature pages in preparation for the official execution of the merger agreement. Yet not a single document had been signed. Every eye drifted back toward Elias Brooks. He remained exactly as he had been since entering the room. Calm. Patient. Entirely undisturbed by the growing impatience surrounding him. The young financial analyst who had noticed his composure earlier quietly refreshed her market dashboard once more. Nothing unusual appeared. Stock prices remained stable. Regulatory alerts showed no changes. She frowned, wondering why she suddenly felt as though everyone else had overlooked something obvious. Across the room, a communications director checked her phone and noticed several missed calls from colleagues downstairs. She ignored them, assuming they could wait until after the ceremony. Charles noticed the distraction and smiled. "Business always finds a way to create unnecessary drama," he joked, drawing polite laughter from several executives. Elias finally shifted his attention away from the clock and looked around the table. He studied every face with remarkable patience, almost as if he were memorizing the expressions rather than participating in the meeting. Some faces showed confidence. Others showed calculation. A few revealed quiet satisfaction at the thought that Brooks Meridian was about to surrender its independence. Elias recognized every one of those expressions. He had encountered them throughout his career. Investors who believed confidence belonged only to familiar faces. Executives who mistook restraint for weakness. Decision-makers who assumed the quietest person in the room understood the least. None of those assumptions had ever survived contact with reality. 1 minute and 20 seconds remained. An assistant entered carrying a tablet and whispered something into the ear of Whitmore's chief legal counsel. The attorney dismissed it with a brief wave of his hand without even asking a question. Whatever the interruption involved, it could wait until after the signatures. Elias noticed the exchange, but offered no reaction. His silver watch reflected a thin line of morning sunlight stretching across the conference table. Charles folded his hands once again. "You still have time to make this easy," he said. "There is no advantage in resisting the inevitable." Elias answered with the same steady voice that never seemed to rise above ordinary conversation. "The inevitable usually arrives without asking for permission." The sentence settled over the room like a question no one could answer. Before anyone could respond, another phone vibrated. Then another. This time the sound came from 3 different places around the table. Executives instinctively reached toward their devices. Attorneys glanced at their screens. Expressions that had remained composed all morning began to shift almost imperceptibly. The digital clock reached exactly 1 minute remaining. The first phone stopped vibrating. Then another. Then nearly every screen around the conference table lit up with the same priority notification. No one spoke. The room that had been filled with quiet confidence only seconds earlier suddenly became occupied by uncertainty. Charles Whitmore glanced at his device with mild annoyance, expecting another routine update from investor relations. Instead, his expression tightened almost imperceptibly before he locked the screen again. Across the table, Elias Brooks did not reach for his phone. He already knew what the message contained because the decision reflected on those glowing screens had not been made that morning. It had been made months earlier. 8 months before the merger meeting, while analysts on financial television debated quarterly earnings and market trends, Elias had quietly boarded a commercial flight to Omaha carrying nothing more than a leather portfolio and a notebook filled with handwritten observations. There had been no photographers waiting at the airport. No press conference. No announcement to shareholders. During that trip he met privately with the trustees of a family investment office that had quietly accumulated voting shares across multiple industries for more than 40 years. They did not ask him about headlines or quarterly profits. They asked him about patience, culture, and what kind of company he intended to build after the cameras disappeared. Elias answered every question without rushing. He never promised impossible growth. He never exaggerated projections. He simply described the kind of leadership that outlasted market excitement. 3 weeks later, another meeting followed in Denver with the retirement fund of a manufacturing union that controlled a surprisingly influential block of proxy votes. Then came Phoenix, Boston, Nashville, and Seattle. Each conversation happened behind closed doors. Each relationship formed quietly. Every signature collected over those months added another piece to a strategy no financial journalist had even imagined. While Whitmore Industrial spent millions shaping public perception, Elias invested his time earning private trust from the people whose votes actually determined the future. The market believed the merger would create one dominant company because that was the narrative repeated in every business publication. Elias never corrected it. Sometimes the strongest strategy was allowing everyone else to become comfortable with the wrong conclusion. Back in the boardroom, another notification appeared across several executive tablets. This time the subject line included the words "updated voting authorization." Attorneys immediately began opening attachments. One board member adjusted his glasses twice before reading the first paragraph again, convinced he had misunderstood. The young financial analyst quietly compared the document against the ownership chart she had reviewed the previous evening. The numbers no longer matched. Somewhere outside the conference room, elevators continued carrying reporters toward the media floor, believing they were about to witness a predictable corporate celebration. Inside, certainty was dissolving one silent realization at a time. Charles slowly lifted his eyes toward Elias. For the first time that morning, he was no longer looking at a man sitting across the table. He was looking at someone who might have been several moves ahead long before either company scheduled today's meeting. Elias simply rested his hands on the unopened merger agreement and glanced once more toward the digital clock as 45 seconds remained. 45 seconds became 44. Then 43. Time no longer felt like a measurement. It felt like the only voice in the room that refused to take sides. Every executive who had dismissed the notifications only moments earlier was now reading them line by line with growing concern. The legal counsel representing Whitmore Industrial refreshed his inbox twice before quietly standing and walking toward Charles Whitmore. He leaned down and whispered only a few words, but the effect was immediate. Charles's relaxed posture disappeared. He reached for his tablet with deliberate care and opened the attached authorization documents himself. The confidence that had filled his face all morning gave way to careful concentration. Across the table, Elias Brooks remained motionless. He did not watch Charles. He did not study the reactions spreading around the room. Instead, he looked toward the city beyond the glass, where morning sunlight reflected from neighboring skyscrapers and transformed them into walls of gold. He had always believed that true leverage revealed itself quietly. Loud victories often required explanation. Real victories spoke for themselves. The communications director finally answered one of the calls she had ignored earlier. Her expression changed before she managed to say a single word. She lowered the phone and turned toward the board. "Every major financial network just updated the story," she said carefully. "They are no longer describing this as a standard merger." Silence answered her. Another attorney opened the revised voting authorization and slowly removed his glasses. "These proxy assignments were legally executed months ago," he said almost to himself. "How did we not see this?" Nobody answered because nobody had an answer. The strategy had never depended on secrecy alone. It depended on everyone looking in the wrong direction. While headlines followed public negotiations, the real decisions had been taking place in quiet conference rooms, private investment offices, and long conversations where reputation mattered more than publicity. Elias understood something many executives never learned. Influence was rarely built on the day everyone noticed it. It was built long before anyone thought to look. 32 seconds remained. A soft notification echoed through the conference room speakers as the secure corporate server synchronized updated governance records across every authorized device. New ownership percentages appeared. Voting blocks reorganized themselves automatically. The projected leadership chart displayed on the presentation screen quietly refreshed without anyone touching the controls. The young financial analyst stared at the numbers in disbelief. She checked the calculations once, then twice. The outcome remained exactly the same. Whitmore Industrial no longer possessed the controlling position everyone had assumed throughout the negotiation. Charles slowly looked across the table. "When?" he asked, his voice calm but noticeably lower than before. Elias finally met his eyes. "Long before today," he answered. Charles searched his face for the satisfaction he expected to find, but there was none. There was no triumph, no arrogance, no desire to embarrass anyone in the room. Only quiet certainty. The same certainty that had never left him since the meeting began. Around the conference table, advisors who had spent weeks preparing for one version of history suddenly realized they were witnessing another. Pens remained suspended above signature pages. Contracts stayed unopened. Every assumption that had shaped the morning was being replaced by a different reality, one document at a time. Above the presentation screen, the digital clock continued its relentless countdown. 20 seconds remained. 20 seconds became 15. Then 10. The room had grown so quiet that the faint hum of the building's ventilation system seemed louder than the voices that had dominated the meeting only minutes earlier. Every executive remained seated, but no one appeared comfortable anymore. Attorneys continued scrolling through legal filings that refused to change no matter how many times they refreshed their screens. Charles Whitmore slowly closed his tablet and looked directly at Elias Brooks. "Explain this," he said. There was no accusation in his voice now. Only a sincere need to understand how an outcome everyone believed impossible had quietly become reality. Elias rose from his chair with the same measured calm that had defined every moment of the morning. He did not straighten his jacket or gather his papers because he did not need either. His unopened merger agreement remained exactly where it had rested since the meeting began. He placed one hand lightly on the back of his chair and allowed his eyes to move around the entire conference table before speaking. "Before anyone signs a single document," he said evenly, "everyone deserves to understand what they are actually agreeing to." No one interrupted him. The confidence that had fueled side conversations and quiet laughter had disappeared completely. Even the assistants standing near the walls remained perfectly still. Elias continued. "For weeks, many of you believed this meeting would decide the future of two companies. It will not. That decision was made months ago when long-term investors chose stability over headlines, preparation over appearances, and trust over assumptions." He paused only long enough for the words to settle across the room. "You believed leverage belonged to the loudest voice because that was the easiest story to believe." Charles listened without moving. Several board members lowered their eyes toward the revised ownership records displayed on their tablets. Elias looked toward the presentation screen where the updated governance structure remained visible for everyone to see. "No one here lost because of a single meeting," he said. "People lost because they spent months preparing for the negotiation they wanted instead of the one that was actually taking place." The young financial analyst who had questioned the numbers finally understood why his confidence had never changed. He had never entered the room hoping to win. He had entered already knowing where every vote stood. Elias rested both hands lightly on the conference table. His voice remained calm, but every sentence carried unmistakable weight. "Some of you looked at me this morning and assumed I would accept whatever terms were placed in front of me. Some believed silence meant uncertainty. Others believed patience meant weakness." He allowed a brief moment of silence before finishing the thought. "You never questioned the agreement. You questioned the man sitting across from you." No one argued because no one could honestly deny it. The room remembered every quiet smile, every whispered assumption, every suggestion that Brooks Meridian had no choice but to surrender influence. Elias gave Charles a respectful nod rather than a victorious smile. "You told me leverage decides everything," he said. "You were absolutely right. The only difference is that leverage was never sitting on this table. It was already waiting outside this room." Above the presentation screen, the digital clock reached 0. Instead of signaling the beginning of the merger ceremony, it marked the moment every person in the boardroom realized the outcome had changed long before any of them had taken their seats. For several long seconds, nobody reached for a pen. The merger agreement that had dominated months of negotiations suddenly became little more than paper resting on polished wood. The presentation screen refreshed once again, this time displaying the newly validated governance structure approved by every required voting authority. There was no dramatic announcement. No flashing headline. Just quiet confirmation that the controlling interest now rested exactly where Elias Brooks had planned. Charles Whitmore slowly exhaled and leaned back in his chair. The confidence that had once filled his posture had been replaced by thoughtful acceptance. He looked toward his legal team, searching for a procedural objection, but every attorney offered the same restrained response. The filings were complete. The proxy authorizations had been verified. Every regulatory requirement had been satisfied. There was nothing left to challenge. One by one, board members who had expected to celebrate a decisive victory quietly closed the folders they had prepared so carefully. Several exchanged brief glances that carried more reflection than disappointment. They realized the greatest mistake had not been overlooking a document. It had been overlooking the person who assembled every document. The communications director's phone rang again. This time she answered immediately. After listening for several moments, she lowered the device and addressed the room. "Every major financial outlet has updated the story. They are calling this one of the most strategically executed corporate transitions in recent years." Nobody reacted with applause. The moment felt too significant for celebration. It demanded perspective instead. The young financial analyst looked across the conference table toward Elias with genuine admiration. Earlier that morning she had wondered why he seemed untouched by pressure. Now she understood that confidence built on preparation never needed to compete with confidence built on appearances. Charles stood slowly and walked around the table until he stopped beside Elias. The entire room watched without speaking. For a brief moment, neither man said anything. Finally, Charles extended his hand. "I underestimated your strategy," he admitted. "More importantly, I underestimated your patience." Elias accepted the handshake without hesitation. "Business is not about proving someone wrong," he replied. "It is about building something strong enough that the truth eventually speaks for itself." Several executives quietly nodded. The sentence carried more weight than any celebration could have. The chief legal counsel gathered the outdated merger packets and replaced them with revised governance agreements reflecting the newly established leadership structure. This time, no one questioned the revisions. Every signature placed on those pages acknowledged the reality that had already taken shape long before the meeting began. Outside the building, reporters who had prepared stories about one company absorbing another hurried to rewrite their headlines as updated filings reached the financial news wires. Camera crews repositioned themselves while producers abandoned carefully written scripts. The narrative had changed in an instant, even though the strategy behind it had taken months to build. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere felt remarkably different. The tension had disappeared, replaced by quiet respect. People who had spent the morning measuring influence by reputation now witnessed the lasting power of preparation, discipline, and vision. As the final signatures were completed, no one remembered the whispered assumptions that had filled the room less than an hour earlier. They remembered only the man who had entered without raising his voice, remained patient while others underestimated him, and transformed an expected surrender into one of the most unforgettable reversals any of them had ever witnessed. When the final signature dried on the last page, no one rushed to stand. The boardroom remained unusually still, as though everyone understood they had witnessed something that could not be measured by stock prices alone. Outside, television crews continued broadcasting live while financial analysts rewrote their market forecasts in real time. The headlines no longer described a company being absorbed. They described a leader who had quietly redefined the outcome before the meeting had even begun. Elias Brooks gathered his unopened copy of the original merger agreement and placed it neatly inside his leather portfolio. He had never needed to read it because it had never represented the future he intended to build. As executives slowly prepared to leave the room, several paused beside him to offer congratulations, not because he had defeated anyone, but because they finally understood the discipline required to earn a victory without spectacle. The young financial analyst approached him with quiet respect. "May I ask you something?" she said. Elias smiled warmly. "Of course." She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "When everyone believed the deal was slipping away from you, were you ever worried?" Elias glanced toward the conference table where empty coffee cups and neatly stacked folders remained exactly where the morning had begun. "Preparation leaves very little room for panic," he answered. "If you spend months building the right foundation, you do not need to spend your final minutes searching for confidence." She nodded slowly, knowing she would remember those words for the rest of her career. Across the room, Charles Whitmore stopped before reaching the door. He turned back toward Elias one final time. "There is something I owe you," he said. Every conversation immediately faded. Charles continued without hesitation. "I believed experience gave me the advantage. Instead, it blinded me to yours. That mistake belongs to me." Elias offered a respectful nod. "Every leader has moments that teach more than victories ever could," he replied. "The important part is deciding what comes next." Charles smiled for the first time that morning without a trace of competition. Then he quietly left the boardroom. Within minutes, the conference floor emptied until only Elias remained beside the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Chicago. The city below continued moving with its usual rhythm. Traffic flowed through the streets. Trains crossed the river. People hurried toward meetings completely unaware that one quiet conversation had changed the direction of two companies. His assistant entered softly and handed him a phone. "The press is waiting downstairs," she said. "They all have the same question." Elias accepted the phone with an easy smile. "I can guess what it is." A reporter's voice came through the speaker a few moments later. "Mr. Brooks, Witnesses said you smiled throughout the final 5 minutes before the agreement changed. Why? Elias looked out across the skyline before answering. People thought I was smiling because I believed I would win, he said calmly. The truth is much simpler. I smiled because I trusted the work no one else had seen. He paused just long enough for the words to settle. Never confuse silence with surrender. Never mistake patience for weakness. And never assume you understand someone's future because of the story you created about them. He ended the call, slipped the phone into his pocket, and walked toward the elevator with the same calm expression he had carried into the room. The difference was that now everyone finally understood the meaning behind that quiet smile, because true leadership did not announce itself when the clock reached 0. It revealed itself long before anyone realized history had already begun.